Welcome to the Blood Flow Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan Hamill. I'm a physician specialized in blood circulation and a writer based in Paris. Today, my guest is Oliver Burkeman. Oliver is a journalist and an author. As a journalist, he wrote a long-running column for The Guardian called This Column Will Change Your Life, where he explored the subjects of productivity, mortality, and the power of limits. He is the author of many books, including The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking, and 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, in which he uses his research in the fields of Taoism, Stoicism, and psychology to explore the subject of time and how we use it. He also writes a twice-monthly newsletter called The Imperfectionist, which I highly recommend signing up for. You can find him online at oliverburkeman.com. Oliver, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. So I want to start with what you call the most fundamental question in time management. And it goes like this. What would it mean to spend the only time you ever get in a way that truly feels as though you're making it count? So I thought about this sentence, and I feel like we can hit a lot of the subjects I wanted to explore just by digging into some specific words of this sentence.
Yeah, probably so. Yeah.
So I want to start with spending time. To spend time in English, anyway, it refers a sense of value to time, something we can own and can dispose of. Do you think this has always been humans' relationship to time?
No, I don't think it has. And I think that, in the book, I sort of play a bit of a double game because I feel like I have to refer to it using words like spend time and make use of time. And then sort of towards the end of the book, I sort of undermine that outlook a bit. I think that obviously where your mind first goes with spending time is this idea that like time is money. I don't actually know whether there's a good metaphorical analogy in terms of verbs in French. I know a little French, but not enough to know whether you do
It's
something
more
like
like
spending.
passing time.
Right. So, obviously people's minds go immediately to, oh, time is money. Have we always thought this way? But it's even more fundamental than that, I think. It's this very notion that time is something we have and can then do something with, either sensible or stupid, meaningful or meaningless. And I think that there's really good reason to believe that for most people in the pre-modern time, and maybe for certain people even today, time would not have felt like something that was separate from you in that way, right? This notion that there's you and then there's time, and you either have a healthy or an unhealthy relationship with time. Well, you can only have a relationship with something that is not you, right? So, and I think that it would have felt much more natural had people been able to even think about it in these terms in, say, medieval times, to just experience time as the medium that life was unfolding in, right? And there's this great distinction in anthropology between task-oriented cultures and time-oriented cultures. And task orientation is this idea that the rhythms of your life just emerge from what you're doing. This is why it's more common among people who work in sort of small scale agriculture, for example, because they're very close to the land and the rhythms of the land. What we're always doing in our sort of modern and knowledge worker lives and city life and all the rest of it is, almost without realizing it, we're kind of taking our activities and lining them up against a schedule, sometimes explicitly, but sometimes just in a more implicit way. And then, if it feels like there isn't enough space for what we need to do, then it feels like we're stressed. And if there's too much space, then we feel bored or something like that. Of course, that's all a spatial metaphor, right? Because in reality, time is just, we are here and doing what we're doing. It's difficult even to put into words.
And do you think
Heidegger
today,
did, but
Heidegger,
complicated words, yeah.
Yes, a complicated word to say that we are time, like,
Right.
yeah. it's not even that we are surrounded by time like fish are surrounded by water. It's more that we are time and there's no distinction.
Right, or that there's no such thing as time other than just our experience of duration, right? I mean, you can go so many different directions in this. In the book, I totally steer clear of physics, right? There's nothing to do with the physics of time. That would be a very bad scene for me to try to get engaged with. And so you have to keep using words like, the idea that it surrounds us, or we can't even see that we're in it. But as you say, right, it's ultimately it's not even that we're in it. It's just that time and us, there's no meaningful distinction between them. Yeah.
And do you think today there are still some societies that are closer to living task-oriented ways?
My understanding is that that's true. You're always on dangerous territory suggesting that there are communities today that are sort of more like medieval communities from the past. This is not always, anthropologists sort of caution against that. But I do think that, just to pick an extreme example, I'm sure that some kind of, barely contacted rainforest indigenous people who have lives perfectly well adapted to the modern age as they live it, but who do not have our reliance on clocks and schedules and on sort of large scale collective action timetables, railway systems, all the rest of it. I think it's my understanding from the anthropology is that is what it's more like for them, and I just think it's true for all of us in isolated moments, right? I mean, I think that we do know what I think people do know from experience what I'm talking about here. It's those moments when maybe just the flow state is an example of it, being deeply absorbed in work. I think people experience it in nature, sometimes talking about when they have newborn babies in their lives, meditation retreats, these kind of times when the time just sort of isn't there. And it's not necessarily because it's enjoyable. I mentioned a few things there that mainly are enjoyable, but it isn't that it's enjoyable. Medieval life certainly wasn't enjoyable most of the time for most of the ordinary people who had to live it. It's just that there isn't this sense of trying to dominate time
So it
and
could be
kind of
something
take
that's
ownership of time. Yeah.
not enjoyable, just that you're so immersed in the experience that you stop thinking about how much time it's taking or what are you going to do after.
Well, I don't know. I don't know enough about your healthcare, medical life to know how much this is relevant to you. But even just people who do not work in medicine, when you do experience an emergency, a true emergency, and you're just doing what needs to be done, or you're helping someone else who's going through some emergency, and you're just helping them in the way that they need to be helped, there is an experience of. I mean, firstly, there's the whole thing about time slowing down in a car accident or something like that. But even just in a more sort of when there are no choices about what I have to do whatsoever, because I just have to take somebody to the hospital or be taken to the hospital or whatever it is. I think it's right to say that there's a kind of calm in that experience, or a peace of sorts in that experience. And nobody would say it was an enjoyable experience. It's terrible. So, I mean, I don't know whether that's something that you have both
I
professional
mean,
experience of as well as personal. But
well, I mean, on the professional side, I would say that if I mainly do ultrasounds, so I'm not looking
not
at
in
my
a
watch all the time,
right.
and it's true, like 3 or 4 hours can go by without really me looking at my clock every 10 minutes and wondering when I'm going to lunch because it's kind of the flow state. So I think that would be
Yeah.
considered not thinking about time. I
Yeah.
haven't experienced it as a patient, luckily, but maybe it's the same. I'm not sure.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, I think there's something very interesting about emergencies, and it's so different from just having lots of urgent things on your to-do list. That's very unpleasant feeling, at least for me. But true emergency, because it removes all the choices, has a peaceful aspect to it. Yeah, I think so.
You should go into the ER just to interview doctors maybe and see what they think.
Well, yeah, I mean, you got to be careful, right? I'm not saying that it's if you interrupted somebody in the middle of that and said, "Are you having a good time?" I mean,
Yeah.
maybe an ER doctor would. I don't know, because they've chosen that as a thing to do in their lives. But obviously, a patient in the ER would not have that view. And yet, I mean, I have this. I think some of my friends and family would say that I have a reputation of being quite good in a crisis. You can sort of depend on me not to freak out. If things need to happen, I'll just get on with it. And it sounds like I'm really praising myself, but mainly what I'm saying there is just the rest of the time I'm just neurotic and second guessing, and oh, am I doing the right thing? Should I do something different? And everyone's getting really annoyed with me for not, and in those moments that all falls away, and you are identified with time in some different sense. You're just in the flow of the events that are unfolding. I think probably task orientation is a good word for that. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, I wanted to also talk about the way you describe time, not only as something to accumulate and try to have control over, but also as something to share. You give examples in the book, the man who lives on a cruise ship and who tells everyone he's the happiest person on earth, or the digital nomads who end up depressed on a desert island with all the time in the world. So, what has your research taught you about people's desire to share time and experiences?
I think this is such an interesting corner of the subject. It's obviously there are there's a certain sort of range of activities that we do because it involves other people and we share that experience. Everything from sort of romance through friendship to just all kinds of social activities. You mentioned you just got back from a tennis match. You can't do that unless you're coordinate with other people. But I think it's even more basic than that. It's just so much of what we do in life. It's so obvious as to almost not need stating. Relies on our time being synchronized with other people's time. So we think of time as sometimes, anyway, these days, as something that we should just try and get more and more solo control over. And then when you do that, as some digital nomads find out, right, who put themselves in a position where they can on a whim, they can change where they are and what they're doing exactly as they wish. Actually, loneliness is a big problem there, because it turns out that so much of what we do relies on being synchronized with other people. And I think that's a real, I was going to say unrecognized problem. I think it is recognized, but just could be more recognized with the kind of society that we have built for ourselves these days, right? I'm sure it's roughly equivalent in Paris to how it is here, that, if I want to meet up with a friend, or let's make it hard, two friends, and we want to like put a date in our schedule, in our diary, to get together and have a beer, like nothing, no big deal. It's just a sort of joke how many weeks and weeks and weeks of back and forth attempts to coordinate
Yep, sounds like Paris.
this involves. And usually it's not actually, people say it's because we're so busy. Well, usually each person involved in that situation has plenty of free time, or at least some free time. It's just not the same free time as the other people. And of course, it only works to have a beer with people if it is the same time. And so there you can see, for example, how, if you lived in a more traditional culture, which certainly has lots of disadvantages, but if you lived in a culture where everybody worked the same hours, all the businesses and shops shut at 5 p.m., maybe everyone shared the same religion, so on Sunday they were all at home, and like immediately everybody is brought into a situation where they can be more easily synchronized, because it's just like, nobody's doing anything else on a Sunday. We moved from Brooklyn in New York to the North Yorkshire countryside where I am now, and it's the modern world. I just have just as much problem coordinating with people to have a beer as I did. But there is this phenomenon I've noticed where, at least to some degree, I'm always a bit surprised that people I'd quite like to hang out with are free to hang out with me. It's like, oh yeah, it's just the weekend. No one's got a particular,
Yeah.
it's not, and so you even notice. I wonder if that's a slight difference being in a place that it's just a little slower moving. There aren't quite so many people commuting long distances to different places to work and things like that. Anyway, I just think that this kind of idea that time is the kind of thing that brings happiness to us and fulfillment, the more that it is coordinated with other people's, is really important.
And plus now we have all the tech to you just have to look at what people are doing, taking pictures and sending them and sharing them. That's also part of it. Not even seeing people in real life, but just sharing your life on the internet now is taking that place because it's easier and just one click away. Obviously,
Yeah.
not the same on the human level, but I think that's
No,
also
absolutely. Yeah.
um, yeah. Even casting directors now only I think they get self tapes,
Yeah.
which used to be in person. So all that is changing for sure. And I've seen that what you were referring to between the difference between living in Paris and Guadeloupe, a Caribbean island,
Right.
where all of a sudden I go there and everyone's free to go have a beer. And in Paris, it's the same probably as Brooklyn. Everyone's very busy. So I
Yeah,
think
I
it's
think this is definitely it's definitely everywhere, but it becomes, for various different reasons, becomes more pronounced in a city context. Yeah.
so. The second part of the sentence I wanted to dig into was the only time we ever get. Because and here I want to talk about hobbies, or as you refer to them in the book. I don't know if it's atelic or atelic activities from the
I
Greek.
tend to say atelic. I've also seen there's also a word autotelic, which is quite similar, that crops up here and there. But anyway, yeah.
Yes. So anyway, in a simple way, hobbies. Why do you think? Well, we talked about hobbies as something maybe where you can also get the state of flow and forget time. Why do you think some hobbies are sometimes frowned upon if you compare them with, say, a side hustle that may bring with it supplementary income?
So my sort of thesis here, I mean, it's not a scientific one. I'm not going to pretend that, is that, yeah, what something that defines a hobby is that it's something that you do for the enjoyment of doing it. Doesn't mean you don't get better, of course. Although in some hobbies you don't. Or some people don't. Like, you can get better at piano playing, but I apparently don't get any better at piano playing. Anyway, but the point is, there is part of the reward, at least, is in the doing of it, rather than where it's headed or what it's for. And that is different, as you mentioned, to this very fashionable notion of a side hustle, which is basically a hobby that you're doing to try to make money or turn it into a business or something. And my sort of thesis, I guess, is that part of what people think of as sort of embarrassing or cringe, as the young people would say now, they probably just use the same word in French, right? I imagine. Is about hobbies actually is because they are not instrumentally useful for something, right? I think that when we sort of roll our eyes a little bit, say, at somebody who collects. I mean, collecting stamps is the old-fashioned example, right? Or collects anything, really. I think that some of us sort of look down on that person, a slightly snobby attitude, and it just seems sort of pointless, right? But in a way, that's the whole point. It's pointless, right? It doesn't have it's not for some other time. It's not for some future goal. It's actually respecting the fact that as a finite human being, your life unfolds in present moments. And at some point, you're going to have to do what matters in in a now, as it were, as opposed to a later. And so that's really, that's why I've tried a little bit in my own life, and I sort of advise it to other people to sort of make space for hobbies and not demand of our activities that they're always leading somewhere. So I write in the book, I love writing, and writing is my main job. And it is sort of a hobby in the sense that I love doing it most of the time. There are bad moments, but it's always got that problem that I want what I'm doing to succeed, and I'd like to make money from it, and I'd like my ego to be boosted by people reading it and liking it. So it's always got that sort of instrumental overlay. And when I put the headphones on and play the piano, it's almost the fact that I am not very good at it that is the liberating part, because the prospect of being paid money for my piano playing is so far out of reach. It's so off on the other side of the horizon that I just don't need to worry about that, and I can just give myself fully to the experience.
What would be a good question to ask oneself to tell if a hobby is a good one, if you can say that a hobby is a good one? Is that one of it, that you will never get paid for it, and you enjoy it even if no one's gonna know about it?
I think that's a great question, right? I don't want to say that you have to be bad at something. I think it's useful to do something that you're bad at, but obviously there are people who for whom music is just a hobby, and they are hugely proficient, and all sorts of creativity and art and sport and many things. I think, would you do it anyway, regardless of anyone noticing that you did it? In terms of discovering what it is that yours should be, I think that old idea, it's sort of a Jungian idea in some ways, but that question about like trying to remember what you found absorbing in childhood can be a very useful one. And then I think it really is that idea of like, would you do it anyway? Are you trying to get to some point where you say, okay, I've done that? Well, if you are, then it's probably somehow been woven into your psychodramas about achievement and self-worth
For sure,
and all the rest of
I
it.
love that you wrote about your friend, the editor, who's very passionate about surfing, while not being very good at it, because that rang a bell with me, because I started surfing kind of later in life and never really lived by the sea, and every time I would surf, I would be frustrated because I wasn't good enough, and I wanted to be good. So one day I just told myself I'm never going to be that good.
Yeah.
And that was actually very liberating. And then I actually got better because I took some lessons and I know my limits, and I just enjoy the fact of doing it.
Right, and because the stakes are removed that as well, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's so hard to get better at something when you're going through it thinking like, this has got to work out. And the moment you're like, well, I don't really care, actually in some ways it gets easier to make progress.
Yeah. Which can be counterintuitive for a perfectionist, for sure.
Totally. I mean, my whole life is just recovery from this, right? So I'm just sort of, I never like this initial process of getting involved in something that I wouldn't say to people listening, watching that you should. A bad test of a hobby or of any activity would be like, do you find that the very moment you begin doing it, you're in ecstasy? Because actually, we are so conditioned to only want to accomplish and optimize and move forward that it can be very uncomfortable at first to do.
I'm sure there are some psychological rewards to doing something you're not very good at and acknowledging that you're not very good at it while still enjoying it, for sure.
Yeah.
And on the subject of this time being the only one we ever get, do you have any favorite questions you ask yourself on a daily basis?
About to do with bringing oneself more into the present moment?
Yes. Do you have a daily ritual, like questions you not every day, but questions that you ask yourself maybe once a week or
Yeah, I mean, I have actually, just on the sort of meta subject that you're asking about, I find that I less and less follow a very sort of strict repeating routine, and I think I can actually justify that in terms of what we're talking about here, right? That actually, you know, I wouldn't want somebody hearing this conversation to think like, well, what's the system that I can set up that will keep me uh, in the moment going forwards, right? Because that's almost a
That's what
contradiction
people
in
want.
terms. I saw somebody on Twitter or somewhere the other day saying like, there was some joke like, uh, I really want to spend more time embracing the unfolding. At some point, I really got to spend more time embracing the unfolding now. Have you got any podcast recommendations? Right? It's like no, it's this. It's never the system. It's never the sort of structure. It's always the moment. But questions, I think, held more loosely than that are totally um, useful. And I, one thing I do quite a lot of is journaling. So I do sort of try to write in a way that gets past my internal senses and just sort of whatever is bubbling up. I find that in itself is very useful for being present, because you're sort of getting rid of any idea that you're writing for a specific goal or trying to create a particular piece of writing. You're just literally sort of letting it flow. I really like a question that I came across, I think from Eckhart Tolle originally once, which was that question, something along the lines of, do you have a problem right now? And it's not impossible, I think, to have a problem right now involving sort of physical danger or something. But most of the time that I'm moaning and whining about some problem in my head, I don't have it right now. It is, there's another old line from Mark Twain, isn't there, about the idea that most of those problems will never even happen.
Yes, I was
They're
thinking
thoughts
about that.
about
Yeah.
future problems, future hypothetical potential problems. Now, so that's good. One thing I find it not useful, I'd be interested in your thoughts, but one thing I find personally not useful is any sort of question along the lines of like, am I savoring the moment? Am I present? Am I here? It doesn't help me to become very self-conscious about that. Ever since I became a parent, people have been saying like, "Oh, you've got to savor this moment and that moment, or it all goes past so quickly. They'll leave home in this many." And it's true, and it's bittersweet, I think, and it's sad. But as the years go by, I realize that does not, and this isn't just a point for parents at all, but like that's true. But the remedy for it is not to remain hyper conscious of it all the time.
Mm.
And if you believe the wrong social media accounts or various other sources of advice, you would think that the way to deal with the fact that life is transient and childhood passes and good times pass and all the rest of it would be to sort of go through life with this very, very furrowed brow, kind of intense and tense attempt to sort of really, really enjoy what's going on. Well, of course, that's no recipe for enjoying things. You sort of have to be willing to waste the time a little bit, I think, in order to
Yeah, I saw
find
a
enjoyment in
good
it.
interview with Jerry Seinfeld, who said the secret of a happy life is wasting your time with things you really enjoy doing.
Yeah, that's really nicely put. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And then you just find sometimes you might have that wonderful moment of like, oh, this is good. I'm enjoying this, but not because you set out to like
right.
suck the value out of life.
Yeah, and I also wanted to talk. This has to do with what you were saying, patience, which is also something we lack very much of in these fast-moving times. Certainly, I'm never been very patient, and I've noticed this. I have a friend who's quite older than me, and so now when we go walking around Paris, he's slowing down. So I have a hard time walking that slowly. So sometimes I get frustrated until I I realize I'm not really in a hurry to get anywhere. So
Right.
I start slowing down, and then I start noticing he's seeing things in a shop window or looking at architecture because he used to study architecture. So this is something I've realized on myself. How can we put, if we can put mechanisms in place in ourselves to try to make ourselves slow down? Do you have a kind of a method for that, or is it just being conscious of it, trying to
It's
think about it?
it's a really good question, because I am also, impatient by nature. That's why I've so drawn to this kind of subject matter, I think. And yeah, I mean, the example you give is very on point, because assuming that you're not going somewhere with this person, assuming the reason that you're meeting up is to go on the walk, then it makes no sense, really, right?
Exactly.
To need to speed up. But we really do, because we're so conditioned to this notion that it's better if we get to the next thing faster, automatically. I really think the most important thing for me in that respect has been getting a bit more willing to just feel the discomfort of it. And so, in the case you give, when you feel that desire to sort of hurry up while you're walking along, it's sort of got two stages, right? You're feeling antsy and restless, and then you're trying to get rid of the restless feeling by speeding up. But you can sort of stop after the first one of those and just sort of feel the discomfort. And of course, it's not serious pain, but it's extraordinary how powerful it can be nonetheless. So yeah, in my case, it really is just a question of being willing to feel that sort of very strange unpleasantness and not act upon it. In the book, I write about this exercise where I, following the advice of a art historian called Jennifer Roberts, I sat and looked at a painting for 3
Right.
hours solid. And it's such an interesting, it was for the first hour anyway, it was as appalling as you could imagine. And yet, kind of why? Because I was sitting on a folding stool in a nice, warm, well-lit art gallery. I wasn't hungry. My life was fine. There's no reason why that should be. It doesn't feel like there's any reason why that should be as unpleasant as it was. But firstly, it is because the sort of not feeling like we have the power to make our experiences go at the speed we want is an incredibly frustrating thing, and getting more frustrating as society accelerates. And secondly, the other great thing about that experience was it was very clear that on the other side of that restlessness, I literally did start seeing things in that painting that I hadn't seen before. Right? I'm not speaking sort of poetically. It's like just actual shapes and actual
Yeah.
lines that apparently with 1 or 45 minutes of staring, I had not been able to see. So, it's very useful to be reminded of the rewards of things like that. This is sort of related as well, something I sort of try to practice sometimes, not very good at it, but I do think it's always useful when I manage it, is just experimentally to not have some audio playing while I cook a meal, or to not try to combine going for a walk up the hill with reading something or listening to an audiobook or something. Just it's quite strange how accustomed I anyway have become to this notion that like all my attentional channels should be occupied.
Yeah, for sure.
It's just not a big deal to leave them unoccupied, and good things happen as a result. Yeah.
Well, they get occupied by one activity. I know what you mean because I was on a walk yesterday along the coast of northern France, and for some part of the walk I was listening to a podcast, and after a while I said maybe I should just listen to the wind and be in nature and live the experience fully. And
Yeah.
you're still occupied, you're just fully occupied with one thing.
Yeah. And when I've written about this, people sometimes say like, well, what's wrong with listening to a podcast while you cook dinner? And the answer is nothing at all. But if you can't not listen to a podcast while you cook dinner, that's interesting, and that seems like something worth challenging in yourself. Yeah.
So I wanted to talk also of something you mentioned in the book, which is the egocentricity bias. So first of all, can you explain what it is, and where do you think this comes from on a societal point of view? Is it just something that's ingrained in our culture and even in our education today?
Oh, fascinating. I mean, I guess, it refers to a lot, but just most simply what I think of as egocentricity bias is the tendency to place ourselves, to see ourselves as more as the center of what is unfolding. So it's things like, there are classic experiments where people sort of walk into a crowded room wearing an embarrassing t-shirt or something, and they assume that, I'm making these figures up, but they assume that like 80% of the people noticed when actually it was only 20%, or so that we sort of assume that everyone's thinking about us. We assume that events depend on us. And the funny thing about this bias is that it's not only sort of arrogant people and grandiose people. There's actually obviously something very egocentrically biased about intense shyness and certain kinds of social anxiety, right? This idea that a whole social gathering would be a total disaster if you said the wrong thing, or the idea that everybody is looking at you because you're not wearing the sort of the clothes that you feel you should be wearing at a particular gathering or something. That in itself is giving yourself too much of a center. I mean, I always avoid the question of where these things come from, because I think the answer is probably some combination of, there are good evolutionary reasons for taking our own lives very seriously indeed. We live in a consumer economy that ceaselessly sort of boosts that notion that we each really matter. It would probably be sort of psychologically intolerable in some sense to have a fully accurate picture of my role in the 8 billion or whatever.
Yeah.
But one of the things I try to bring out in the book is just that I think that this trips us up, because it makes us, one of the ways it trips us up is it makes us think that the things we're doing with our time are only meaningful if they reflect that kind of importance, right? So
Right. That brings us back to hobbies that no
right.
one care about anyway, which is a
Yeah,
good
no,
thing.
actually, and this notion that's very strong in the culture that like changing the world is very important, and
Yes.
like if you don't do, if what you do with your life is forgotten about in 100 years' time, or if it only affects 10
Yeah.
people, then
Surprise,
it
it will
wasn't
be.
worth doing. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw. It reminds me of a clip I saw of the actor Henry Cavill who played Superman, and he was standing in Times Square in front of a gigantic poster of the new movie for like an hour, and he was like, "Well, I've been here an hour and no one's recognized me." I thought that was great.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, and so the point out, yeah, so I think it's just like, uh, it's fine that people, and probably important to some degree, that people think of themselves as more important than they are, but when that leads us to concluding that we're living insufficiently meaningful lives, that's a pity, right? To reach that conclusion just because you're doing something ordinary or low scale. I mean, any of us, with the just possibly the exception of the most powerful people on the planet, are doing things that are only a drop in the bucket, of course.
Yeah. So how do you try? How can you try to get from this egocentricity bias to what you call in the book cosmic insignificance therapy, which is a great title.
Well, that's really, yes, my sort of frivolous way of talking about the fact that it's actually very relaxing in a way to be reminded that the stakes are lower than I thought, that you know if I don't succeed at the project I'm working on now, like, it possibly won't even bother me in a couple of years, but it certainly won't bother the planet. And that can be sort of therapeutic. I'm not really suggesting that we should just sort of kick back and do nothing, because why does it matter? I'm just
Yeah,
trying
of
to
course.
argue, borrowing partly from a philosopher called Ido Landau. I'm trying to sort of suggest, well, maybe the problem here is our standard of meaning, right? I mean, who says anything I do has to be cosmically significant for it to be a good way of spending my time? If you say that it does, then you end up in all sorts of tangles, like, doing a small amount to care for the environment is useless because it's not going to make the decisive difference between in terms of what happens to the climate. Or just things like, I mean, the work that I do affects obviously only a tiny proportion of the people on the planet. The work that you do as well, right? It's like it's uh, things that, if like if you care for somebody in your family, or you cook meals for your kids, like, probably in a it's not going to be something that registers in centuries time, but nobody really thinks it isn't meaningful to.
Well, yeah, you can really live like that, just thinking that everything I'm doing has no meaning. That's also impossible in some way.
Right, but also, like, meaning can just be a smaller thing, right? It can be
Right.
meaningful to have a family. It can be meaningful to help, 20 people in your life. And the problem there, I think, and as we all know that that's true. People who have anything meaningful going on in their lives feel the meaningfulness of it. But then we also, when we start to think sort of verbally or explicitly about, like, how should I build a meaningful life, we have this tendency to slip into the idea, oh, well, it better be something that makes a really big splash. It better be unusual. It better involve some level of public acclaim. And so that blocks people from concluding that maybe, at least in some cases, what would be most meaningful for them would be a very quiet kind of existence.
For sure. Or even, I mean, for me personally, doing this podcast, sometimes I have to remind myself it's okay if I don't have 10 million views every
Right.
video. It's still meaningful, just to me learning things and having
Yeah.
conversations. And if people listen to them, that's just a bonus. But it's hard because we're so ingrained in thinking, oh, I have to have a super popular show and everything. But that's just
But the
sheer
crazy thing is,
pressure.
whatever level you get to, if you zoom up another level, it's tiny, right? So
If exactly.
this book, 4,000 Weeks, has done much better than anything else I've ever written. And it's very flattering, and my ego is boosted because, actually, compared to most authors, I do have a big audience. But then I can just zoom out to the authors who have a much, much bigger audience than me, and then, zoom out from books. Nobody reads books as a proportion of the world population. So you can always you can always get very easily to the point at which what
Exactly.
you're
What
doing
you
is
need to do is
insignificant.
start
Yeah.
dancing on TikTok if you want. um, so, speaking of life and work life balance. Sorry, what do you think exactly is work-life balance, and can we even expect to get it, or is that also something that's kind of made up?
I mean, I've always been skeptical of this term, partly because it seems to surrender at the beginning the idea that work can be, maybe that's not what's meant for it by it, but that work can be a really fundamental, integral part of a fulfilling life. That there's, like, work and then there's your life. Well, maybe it is that way for a lot of people, unfortunately, but surely we should aspire to the idea that it's more than that. And then that's just the label, I guess. And then beyond that, I think this notion of balance, it tends to be unhelpful, because it's usually just felt as a pressure, right, to sort of be incredibly successful in your work and incredibly successful in your personal life. And I think at least some people feel it as a pressure, right? It's not just that they wish they could spend much more time doing things other than work. It's that they feel they ought to have a very active work life and a very active non-work life. And then just that notion, that sort of perfectionistic notion that you're going to get to the right balance and then live out your life in that way, as opposed to, and I'm certainly not the first to say this, but the idea that certain kinds of imbalance in a cyclical or seasonal way can be very sensible. So, certainly I think something in terms of how we're pretty much designed to function speaks more in favor of seasons of intense work and then seasons of not working, and finding balance in that way over a year or over a career. Plus, of course, there may be some people, I'm sure there are some people out there for whom, to some degree, I might even be one of them, for whom a disproportionate focus on work sort of is them living their best life, right? It's not necessarily workaholism. It's not necessarily succumbing to economic pressures. And likewise, society makes it difficult in certain ways, but we ought to be able to celebrate the idea that there are people whose main meaning in life is not going to be in paid work, and that ought to be fine too.
Sure. Yeah. Some people love doing nothing. And I want to talk also about doing nothing, which is a big part of using time.
Sure.
And yeah, so how hard is doing nothing? And by doing nothing, do you mean physically doing nothing, or is it also just kind of meditation, trying to think of nothing, being in the moment?
Yeah. I use this phrase and I refer to what Shinzen Young, the meditation teacher, calls do nothing meditation. Obviously, on a number of levels, it's impossible to do nothing. Your blood is pumping. Even I know that, and you know it for sure, right? And if you're sitting in a chair trying to take no actions, you're still sitting in a chair. So there's all that sort of,
Sure.
Of course, you can't really do literally nothing. I think what I really mean, and what is meant in the idea of practicing doing nothing, is repeatedly unclenching or ungrasping that attempt to will things to be different, right? So, or to distract yourself. So something that the way that this sort of understanding this as a kind of meditation, you could set a timer for 10 minutes or something, sit in a chair and just resolve to do nothing, and then you'll fail, but every time you fail you can sort of let go of the thing you're doing. So instead of focusing on your breath, which is obviously the classic form of meditation, if you find yourself focusing on your breath, you sort of let go of that and go back to doing nothing. Then you'll think about something and let go of that, and it's really the gesture and the sort of metaphorical muscle that you're training,
Showing
which is
up.
to not need things to be different and to not try to be constantly manipulating experience. Now, of course, really, it's not literally doing nothing, but I think that's the idea. The idea that our sort of basic state, a lot of the time anyway, is to go through life feeling that something is wrong about how we're experiencing it and needs changing. And it's very powerful to learn to a little bit. I haven't got further than a little bit. Relax that urge.
Yeah, and not stop thinking that it will get better even in an hour or two if we do the right things. Just trying to be in that moment.
Right, and it's all always changing anyway, right? So
Yes.
nothing's going to stay the same, whatever happens. So, I think Buddhism is very good on this among the different traditions. That idea that it's not only that we sort of rail against experiences that we dislike, it's also that we try to hold on to experiences that we are enjoying, as if we could sort of take ownership of them. And of course, that just undermines the capacity to actually enjoy them.
Yeah, so we're deep into the third part, which is I'll say that the definition again is, what would it mean to spend the only time you ever get in a way that truly feels as though you're making it count? And I think this is part of we're talking about what it truly feels like, um, as opposed to what people think you should be
Yeah.
doing or think you should be feeling and why you should be doing these things. So that's really part of what we're talking about. And I want to come back to journaling, which is something you can do to really actually feel the moment. Just how do you do it? Do you have like the 5 minute journal or something, or is it just free writing? Would you have a set time? Do
Um,
you use a pen and paper, old school, or?
yeah, I use a pen and a paper, a narrow ruled uh, notebook. Usually, what I've done is basically my version anyway of morning pages. So first thing in the morning, writing 3 sides of a narrow ruled A A5 notebook. Yes, A5 notebook. Um, which with my handwriting, that's probably half an hour or something. I've sort of changed that a little bit here and there recently, and I do it more. Sometimes I time it instead of do it by number of pages. It doesn't matter, I don't think. I think what really matters is to get used to the idea that the pen keeps moving, and you don't go into that mode of like, I'm now going to stare out the window for 10 minutes until I can think of something good to write. And that's the bit I find hard, but also incredibly rewarding, right? It's just like, okay, the pen is going to keep moving. Maybe some good things will come out, maybe nothing good will come out. That's not the challenge here. The challenge is to not stop. And it doesn't mean you have to go very fast or anything, right? It's just that at an ordinary, gentle, steady pace, you're not going to stop. And that I find very useful because it gets rid of some kind of internal,
So very
bypasses an
different.
internal sensor. Yeah.
Yeah, very different from, say, writing a novel where you're going to block out 1 or 2 hours, and if you're not writing, it's not a big deal. At some point, you're going to stop writing. So this is
Yes.
really
Yeah.
getting the pen moving and seeing
Yeah.
what happens.
Although I will say that for the book I've been writing now, I have had to I was sort of forced by, I don't know, I found my old ways of writing sort of stopped working for me, and I did move more towards this kind of free writing approach for that too. Now, in the context of a book, you then have to go back and do a lot of cleaning up and reordering
Sure.
and editing. But there's something that the perfectionist in me hates so much about like making a big mess on the page, even though nobody's going to see it until it's tidied up, right? But it's like, I don't like that. And it's been quite difficult, but I think it's very beneficial.
So you're writing the book also by hand on a notebook?
No, oh, sorry. No, I should clarify. Not necessarily by hand, but the first stage of writing that book takes place in sessions where I just keep writing,
Oh, okay.
even if I don't feel like I've got anything to write at that moment. So I'm just letting my, I don't know, unconscious go to the page without frontal cortex in the middle or whatever. I'm sure it's not quite how it works. And that would be totally unreadable as a finished product, but it's actually really useful as an initial
For
part of
sure. I mean,
part
you
of the
can't
process.
you can't correct nothing, but you can work on a manuscript on something. That's
Right,
that's
and very
really
quickly, if you do that for an hour, like you've got thousands of words at that point to
exactly.
start with, right? Yeah. And I find that actually, I used to think that was worse than just that very sort of constipated approach to writing where you finally get out a sentence, but it's a good sentence. But now I'm finding that it's actually I don't enjoy, the perfectionist in me doesn't enjoy it, but it's actually very useful to push through that. And
But don't you love correcting it and then it's perfect?
yeah, to some extent, that's where the neurosis comes back in, right? Like that's where I get to be that guy.
Yeah.
Um, and it's, yeah, that's fine. But it's just turned out to be no longer a good way of doing the first draft for me. Yeah.
And can you tell us what this new book is about?
Yeah, it's just a short book. It's called Meditations for Mortals, and it's based in significant part on my email newsletter. It's essentially it's designed as a sort of a 4-week course in a way, right? A chapter per day for 28 days. Although I'm not going to I can't force anyone to read it in that way. Designed to sort of take the reader on a journey into sort of embracing their limited time and then turning that into action. I'm trying to get very pragmatic here after, I think 4,000 Weeks is to some extent, it's more a book about the ideas. And here I really wanted to try to address this challenge of like, what do you do differently on a day-to-day basis in order to spend more and more of your time doing the things that you care about? So I tried to have the structure of the book reflect that. And my sort of dream is that someone would read it, over 4 weeks, and that these tiny little perspective shifts would manifest themselves in how they live their daily lives. But we'll
Can
see.
you give us an example of something you do on a daily basis?
Well, so I mean, I can, but if you're talking about what I was saying there, an example of it is not so much something to do every single day, but just a sort of an additional tool each day that you can sort of keep in your cupboard of tools. So one that I found very useful that I write about in this new book, and I've written about in the newsletter here and there, is the idea of going looking for decisions to take. I think that when you're stuck in procrastination, when you don't know what the next move is, it's a really useful strategy to find some decision that needs making in the project, and to take it and put it behind you. It could be very small, but this idea of like decision hunting, as I term it in the book, that's just one more, and I probably won't need that every day, but every few days I'll be at some sort of sticking point, and I'll be like, oh, why don't I cross that bridge? Why don't I deal with that decision? And it's not that they have to be, I explain this in more detail in the book, but it's not that they have to be big decisions, right? It's not that they have to be, it's just that they have to be relatively irreversible. So the example I always give is, or one of the examples I always give is, like, if you're launching a website, you could make the decision about which platform you're going to use, right? It's not a huge world-shattering decision, but it's just one of those things that once you've done it, all the path dependencies will make it relatively hard to go back on. And so you'll be propelled forwards onto the next thing. And little choices like that are I find really useful as a way of getting out of procrastination.
And could they be related to another project, just to have the process of making a decision, even if it's in something concerning something else?
Sure. I think motivation, like I go back and forth between making and taking decisions. It's take in French, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In English, it's make. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's in French, it's taking. Prendre.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. In English, it can sort of be both, I think.
Really?
Right. What you're doing is you're moving into a more honest relationship with reality in that moment, right? So you're sort of saying, in every moment, I'm making decisions anyway. Every moment is a choice between a million things you could do at that moment. So when you make that consciously, you're sort of falling into line with reality, and I think that gives you a lot of power and motivational, a sort of motivational boost, whether it's on the main project that you're working on or not. And a related thing is just sort of finishing things, right? Even if that means defining them as smaller chunks so that you can finish them more easily. It is so much more powerful to, write a slightly difficult email that you've been thinking about, finish writing it and send it, than it is to sort of begin it and have it hanging around in your drafts folder. And these things sort of build on themselves, and before you know it, you're sort of enjoying, like, moving through your day, like dispatching things. So that's just one example. There are a whole lot of others, but again, yeah, it's not like make sure you do this every day from now on for the rest of your life, but just like, here are a whole bunch of tools to use when it feels right.
Great. When can we expect this to be ready?
This will be ready in the UK in September, the US in October, and in French translation at a later date.
All
Sorry,
right.
nothing specific right now.
Okay, great. Well, Oliver, thanks so much for taking the time. It's been really interesting. I had more questions, but maybe another time. So,
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation. It's been
oh,
great. Thank
great.
you.
So once again, your latest book, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, is still available everywhere books are sold. So please check it out. It's super interesting. Really, a lot of nuggets in there. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. This was the Blood Flow Podcast.